I remember the trip vividly, the way it started out as something simple, a weekend escape into the woods to get away from the noise of the city. I had planned everything myself, wanting to feel the raw edges of nature without distractions. My backpack was heavy with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a first aid kit, extra clothes, a small stove, a compass, a map, and a headlamp. I left early on a Friday morning, driving for hours along winding roads, the trees growing denser with every mile. I felt a strange thrill as the city faded behind me, replaced by a quiet so thick it pressed against my ears. I had picked a spot that seemed perfect, a clearing next to a small creek, surrounded by thick forest. I arrived just before noon. The sun was high, filtering through the branches, painting moving patterns on the forest floor. I parked my car, unloaded my gear, and began setting up camp. The process was methodical. First, I cleared the ground, removed rocks and sticks, leveled the area for the tent, then laid out my sleeping bag and mattress. I tied the tent poles together, stretched the fabric taut, and secured the stakes into the soft soil. By the time I was done, the air was still, almost unnervingly so, as if the forest had paused to watch me. I decided to explore a bit before it got dark. I followed the creek upstream, stepping carefully over slippery rocks, my boots leaving faint prints in the wet soil. The water was clear, cool, and fast-moving, carrying fallen leaves and small twigs downstream. Birds called occasionally, but their sounds seemed distant, muffled by the thick canopy. I kept an eye out for signs of wildlife, squirrel tracks, bird nests, deer paths, but the forest seemed empty in the midday sun. That emptiness had a weight to it, a subtle unease I tried to shake off. Returning to camp, I started a small fire in the fire pit I had dug. I arranged stones around it, placed some dry twigs underneath, and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, and the smell of smoke mixed with damp earth was comforting. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans, the heat of the fire warming me against the cool forest air. As I ate, I noticed small changes in the environment. Shadows from the trees stretched longer than they should, and the sounds of the forest grew quieter. Even the creek's gurgle seemed subdued, like the forest was holding its breath. Night came sooner than I expected. I climbed into my tent just as the sky darkened, the last light disappearing in streaks of orange and purple. Outside, the forest was a black mass, the outlines of trees faint against the dim sky. I turned on my headlamp to check my supplies, the small circle of light illuminating the inside of my tent. Everything was in order, yet I could hear the forest breathing around me. Small rustles, the snapping of branches, the occasional thump of something moving through leaves. I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons, nothing more. Still, the noises were closer than I had anticipated, almost deliberate, as if they were circling my camp. Sleep came in short bursts. Every snap of a twig, every rustle made my heart race. I kept my knife nearby, my flashlight within reach, my ears straining to catch any unusual sound. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of heavier footsteps, crunching leaves that were too deliberate to be random wildlife. I froze, listening. They came from the far side of my clearing, just past the fire pit. I sat very still, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, that it was just a bear or a large raccoon. But the steps continued, moving slowly, carefully, almost inspecting the area. I unzipped the tent slightly, careful not to make a sound. The moonlight spilled into the opening, faintly illuminating the clearing. That's when I saw it. A figure, human-shaped, moving just beyond the reach of my firelight. My stomach dropped, my body frozen with fear. The figure paused, and I could see the outline of a backpack, maybe a jacket, but no features were clear. It didn't make any noise beyond the crunch of leaves under its boots. I felt completely exposed, sitting in a tent with thin fabric between me and this unknown person. The minutes stretched, each one longer than the last. I considered staying put, hoping it would leave, but then it moved closer. Slowly, carefully, stopping whenever it sensed movement from the tent. Panic set in, sharp and cold. I had my knife, but I was inside a flimsy tent. I could run, but the figure was between me and the path back to the car. I realized I had to make a decision. Stay and risk being discovered, or escape into the dark woods and hope to find safety. I chose to escape. I waited until the figure moved away slightly, then quietly unzipped the opposite side of the tent and slipped out. The forest was pitch black. The only sounds were my own rapid breathing and the occasional snap of a branch beneath my boots. I moved quickly, trying to stay silent but also wanting distance. The creek was on my left, the moonlight reflecting off it just enough to give me some orientation. I followed it downstream, thinking it might lead me to a road or campsite. I stumbled several times, my legs cutting through thick underbrush, my hands scraping against branches. Every rustle made me jump. Every shadow seemed to twist into a human form. I reminded myself over and over, focus on the creek, stay on the path, stay calm. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 40 minutes, I saw a faint glow ahead. Relief surged through me, but I stayed cautious, moving slowly. As I got closer, I realized it was the lights of a small ranger station at the edge of a park road. I ran the last few meters, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I banged on the door until a tired-looking ranger opened it, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I explained, breathless, that someone had been near my camp, following me. He took me seriously, radioed the local authorities, and offered me a warm place to sit, water, and reassurance. While we waited, he explained that there had been a string of small thefts and break-ins in isolated areas recently, hikers being watched, sometimes approached. He believed I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous encounter. In the hours that followed, they organized a check of my campsite. The authorities found evidence of someone having been there. Footprints, a small fire still warm from earlier in the evening, a backpack that didn't belong to me hidden near the tree line. It confirmed that I hadn't imagined anything. Relief was overwhelming, but so was the lingering fear. I hadn't slept well in days after that, and when I finally drove home, I realized how easily things could have gone wrong. Afterward, I took several precautions. I never camped alone again, always letting someone know my exact plans and expected return. I started carrying a whistle, pepper spray, and a more powerful flashlight. I studied ways to stay hidden, to move quietly, to identify human movement in the dark. Every trip I took afterward, I remembered that night. The dense black of the forest, the deliberate steps around my tent, the human shadow in the moonlight. It shaped how I approached wilderness trips forever. In hindsight, the experience taught me a brutal but necessary lesson about wilderness safety. Nature itself isn't inherently dangerous, but human unpredictability can be. The woods, so peaceful and quiet during the day, can become a trap at night when someone with ill intent is present. That night could have ended badly, but because I stayed calm, made a decision to escape, and sought help, it didn't. I returned to that forest once more months later with a friend, this time properly equipped, and the beauty of it came through safely without fear. I realized that preparation, awareness, and respect for both nature and other people are what make camping truly safe and rewarding. Even now, years later, whenever I pack my gear and drive into the wilderness, I remember that night vividly. I feel the same cautious anticipation, the same thrill of solitude, but I also carry the weight of that experience, the knowledge that fear in the right moment can save your life. That weekend taught me more about survival, observation, and self-reliance than any guidebook ever could. It wasn't just a scare. It was a lesson that reshaped the way I approach life in the outdoors. I had always thought camping was a simple thing, packing my gear, hiking into the woods, sleeping under the stars, and spending a few days disconnected from everything. I was not unprepared. I had a sturdy tent, a thick sleeping bag, a reliable backpack full of food, a water filter, a first aid kit, and even a small emergency flare kit. I had been camping before, though not in deep wilderness like this. This trip was supposed to be my solo adventure, my chance to test myself. The idea of being alone in the forest excited me. I wanted to prove to myself that I could survive with nothing but my gear, my knowledge, and my instincts. I drove for hours along winding roads, leaving the small town behind and eventually turning onto a narrow dirt track that led deep into the mountains. The air changed as I climbed higher, getting colder, sharper, and fresher. By the time I parked near a small clearing that looked like a decent spot to set up camp, the sun was low on the horizon. I carried my backpack through thick brush, stepping over fallen branches and avoiding mud puddles. I chose a spot that seemed flat enough, surrounded by trees but not too close, where a fire could be safely built. I set up my tent with precision. The poles clicked together, the fabric stretched tight, and the stakes went into the ground securely. I laid out my sleeping bag inside and arranged my supplies in an organized fashion. After setting up, I collected firewood. Dry sticks were scattered along the ground, some half covered by fallen leaves. I stacked them neatly and set a small pile aside to start my fire after nightfall. As the sun sank lower, shadows stretched across the clearing. The forest was alive with quiet sounds: rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the occasional snap of a twig from some animal moving far off. I started a small fire, the flames licking at the dry wood. I cooked some of the food I had brought, instant noodles and canned beans, using the fire to heat water. The warmth was comforting, the smell of food filling the otherwise silent air. Night fell faster than I expected. The temperature dropped sharply. I put on an extra layer and sat close to the fire, observing the darkness around me. The forest looked different at night. Shapes moved in the shadows. Every rustle made me tense, but I kept reminding myself that it was just animals or the wind. My fire gave me a circle of light and warmth, but beyond it, darkness pressed in. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It whistled through the trees and rattled the tent. I secured all the flaps and lay inside my sleeping bag, trying to sleep. The noises were unsettling. The distant howl of some animal, the branches snapping under the weight of the wind. I kept imagining large shapes moving between the trees, but I knew it was just my mind exaggerating. I had to calm myself. At about 2 in the morning, I heard something that made my heart race. A low, deliberate crack of a branch, not far from my camp. Too close to be a deer or a small animal. I froze, listening. Then another crack, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through leaves. I grabbed my flashlight, switched it on, and slowly peered outside the tent. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing, just shadows and trees swaying in the wind. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear was passing by, though it was unusual for bears to come this close to a fire. I reminded myself that making noise and keeping calm would keep most wild animals away. I stayed awake for hours, my ears straining for any movement. Every sound made me tense, and every shadow looked like something alive. I barely slept, dozing in short bursts. By morning, I was exhausted. The fire had died down, leaving only embers. I stepped outside to assess the situation. Everything looked normal, but my nerves were on edge. I packed up some supplies and decided to explore a little, staying within a short distance of the clearing. The forest was thick, with uneven terrain and tangled roots. I moved cautiously, stepping over rocks and through underbrush. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It whistled through the trees and rattled the tent. I secured all the flaps and lay inside my sleeping bag, trying to sleep. The noises were unsettling. The distant howl of some animal, the branches snapping under the weight of the wind. I kept imagining large shapes moving between the trees, but I knew it was just my mind exaggerating. I had to calm myself. At about 2 in the morning, I heard something that made my heart race. A low, deliberate crack of a branch, not far from my camp. Too close to be a deer or a small animal. I froze, listening. Then another crack, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through leaves. I grabbed my flashlight, switched it on, and slowly peered outside the tent. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing, just shadows and trees swaying in the wind. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear was passing by, though it was unusual for bears to come this close to a fire. I reminded myself that making noise and keeping calm would keep most wild animals away. I stayed awake for hours, my ears straining for any movement. Every sound made me tense, and every shadow looked like something alive. I barely slept, dozing in short bursts. By morning, I was exhausted. The fire had died down, leaving only embers. I stepped outside to assess the situation. Everything looked normal, but my nerves were on edge. I packed up some supplies and decided to explore a little, staying within a short distance of the clearing. The forest was thick, with uneven terrain and tangled roots. I moved cautiously, stepping over rocks and through underbrush. Around mid-morning, I noticed something odd. Tracks large, deep impressions in the soil, leading from the direction of my campsite and disappearing further into the forest. My stomach dropped. They were too large for a deer or a dog, and they were spaced in a way that suggested a heavy animal. My first thought was a bear, and the thought of encountering one unnerved me. I carefully backtracked to my tent, deciding I needed to stay alert and make as much noise as possible to avoid surprise encounters. I spent the day reinforcing my campsite. I built a larger fire pit, stacked more wood, and secured my food in a tree using a rope, making it harder for animals to reach. I stayed near the fire as much as possible, watching the forest around me, noticing how silent and still it could be when no wind blew. But the tension never fully left me. Every rustle, every shadow, kept my senses heightened. By evening, I had settled into a routine of feeding the fire and checking the surrounding area. I noticed that the tracks from that morning seemed to be circling the clearing, as if something was lurking nearby, watching, moving quietly through the underbrush. The thought made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to stay calm. I reminded myself that panicking could make things worse. Night came again. The wind was stronger, the cold more biting. I stayed awake longer than the previous night, listening to the sounds of the forest. Around midnight, I heard a deep growl, not from far away, but close. I froze, heart pounding, ears straining. Something was moving just beyond the trees. The growl came again, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. I realized it was no ordinary animal. It was something large, possibly a bear, and it had been attracted by my campfire and food. I stayed as still as I could, trying not to make a sound. I could hear it moving, sniffing around the clearing. My mind raced. I had read about bear behavior and knew not to run or provoke it, but staying in the tent felt dangerous too. Hours passed like this. The bear, or whatever it was, stayed close, circling, sniffing, grunting occasionally. My flashlight was useless. It made me visible. I had to wait it out, hoping it would lose interest. By early morning, just before dawn, it finally left, moving slowly away into the deeper forest. My body was tense, sore from lying in the same position, and my mind exhausted from fear. I didn't sleep that day either. I decided to pack up and leave immediately. Everything I had brought felt heavier. Every sound made me jump. I kept a makeshift walking stick ready, carrying my backpack with as much speed as the terrain allowed. The tracks from the previous day confirmed that the animal had been around, circling my camp. I kept my eyes and ears open, moving carefully but quickly toward the trail that would lead me back to the road. By late afternoon, I reached the dirt road where I had left my car. Relief washed over me when I saw it, intact and undisturbed. I loaded my gear hastily, checked the tires, and started the engine. As I drove down the winding path, I couldn't shake the memory of the sounds at night. The growl, the rustling, the shadowy figure circling my camp. The forest looked harmless in daylight, but I knew it had been alive with danger. When I finally reached the town, I parked and sat in the car for a long while, breathing deeply, letting the normal sights and sounds of civilization ease the tension. I knew that my planning, knowledge, and caution had kept me safe, but the experience had left its mark. I had faced real fear, a primal fear, and had survived by staying calm, observant, and prepared. After that trip, I never underestimated the wilderness again. I continued to camp, but always with caution, always respecting the power of the forest and the animals that lived there. I understood that survival depended not on bravado, but on preparation, patience, and awareness. That trip became a benchmark for me, proof that fear can be faced and overcome with careful thought and steady action, and proof that leaving a forest alive and unscathed is a combination of skill, luck, and respect for nature. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in the woods, away from the noise of the city, that gave me a sense of freedom I never found anywhere else. The smell of the trees, the feel of dirt under my fingers, the quiet broken only by the occasional bird or rustle in the leaves. It all made me feel alive in a way that nothing else did. I had done my fair share of camping trips before, but the one I was about to take was different. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and my gear, deep in a forest I had only heard about in stories from old hikers online. I wanted isolation, a chance to be completely alone in the woods, and at first, I thought it would be perfect. I packed my bag carefully, making sure I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, extra food, first aid kit, compass, flashlight, batteries, fire starter, and a small hand axe. I had also brought a map of the forest area, though I didn't plan to rely too much on it. I liked the idea of wandering, of letting the forest guide me. The drive there was long, winding through narrow roads surrounded by thick trees on both sides. The closer I got, the quieter it became. There were fewer houses, fewer cars, fewer people. By the time I parked at the small trailhead where I would begin my hike, the sun was low, casting a dim golden light across the forest floor. The trail was rougher than I expected. Roots twisted across the dirt path, and rocks jutted up in places, threatening to trip me if I wasn't careful. I pushed my backpack higher on my shoulders, feeling the weight of all my supplies. I had planned to hike for a few hours before finding a spot to set up camp, something off the trail but still close enough to find my way back if needed. The forest was dense, older than any I had ever seen before. The trees were tall and thick, their branches weaving together high above to block out most of the fading light. As I walked, the air grew cooler and damper. I could smell the moss and the wet earth, a smell that was both comforting and strange, almost pungent in its intensity. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a clearing that seemed suitable for camping. It was a small opening surrounded by tall pines, with a shallow stream running along one side. I could hear the water trickling over rocks, a sound that made me feel like I was deep in the wilderness where no one would find me. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there were no obvious signs of animals having camped there recently, which made it perfect. I set up my tent slowly, making sure it was secure and flat. I laid out my sleeping bag, unpacked my food, and stored the rest in my backpack inside the tent so it wouldn't attract any wildlife. By the time I was done, the sun had set, leaving the forest in dim twilight. I started a small fire, just enough for light and warmth. The flames crackled and popped, casting long shadows that danced across the trees around me. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, feeling the chill of the evening air against my skin. Night in the forest is different from night anywhere else. There's no streetlight glow, no distant hum of cars, no faint sounds of people. It's a silence that presses against you, but it is alive with movement if you pay attention. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, every low murmur of the wind through the trees carries a weight you notice immediately. I listened carefully, telling myself it was just small animals moving around. That's what I kept telling myself, trying to stay calm. Around midnight, I decided to get some sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I zipped myself into the tent, making sure everything was secure. I had a flashlight next to me, fully charged, and I slept in my clothes so I could get out quickly if needed. At first, I drifted off easily, exhausted from the hike, but I was soon awakened by a faint, rhythmic crunching outside my tent. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too regular, too deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound was slow and steady, coming closer and then stopping, then moving again. My heart started to pound. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound didn't match what a deer would make. It was heavier, measured. Someone or something was walking just beyond the edge of my clearing. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just tried to listen. The sound stopped, and for a long moment, I heard nothing. Then I heard another noise, a rustle, closer this time, just at the edge of the trees. My heart was racing, and I knew I had to be careful. I could not see who or what it was, and I knew any sudden movement could draw attention. I slowly reached for my flashlight and unzipped just enough to peer out. The beam of the flashlight hit nothing at first, just the empty trees and shadows. Then, a movement. I saw a figure, tall and thin, moving silently among the trees. I couldn't make out details, but I could see it was humanoid, walking deliberately along the edge of the clearing, watching, or maybe searching for something. My mind raced, thinking of all the worst possibilities. A hunter, a trespasser, someone lost, someone dangerous. I was unarmed except for my small hand axe, and I knew that wouldn't do much if it came down to it. I stayed very still, letting the figure move past the flashlight beam, trying to stay calm and quiet. After what felt like an eternity, the figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the faint sound of footsteps fading away. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I debated staying, debating whether to pack up quietly and leave, but the idea of walking in the dark through unknown trails filled me with fear too. I decided to wait, hoping the figure had left the area. I stayed awake, flashlight ready, ears straining for any sound. The night felt impossibly long. At dawn, I finally felt a little safer. The forest was still, and the light of the rising sun gave me some relief. I decided to pack up immediately, not wasting a second. As I moved quietly, I noticed signs that made my stomach twist. Broken branches, footprints not like any animal I had seen, and marks on some trees that looked like they had been recently cut or scratched. Someone had been near my campsite during the night. I didn't know who, I didn't know why, and I didn't want to find out. I packed quickly but carefully, making sure I had everything, then began to hike back to the trailhead, staying alert to every sound. The hike back was tense. I moved faster than I had on the way in, listening constantly. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement through the trees, but each time it turned out to be shadows or animals. I tried not to panic, keeping my mind focused on the path ahead. By midday, I reached a small stream that I recognized from my map. I took water and rested briefly, but I didn't stop for long. The thought of someone following me still lingered in my mind. Eventually, after several more hours of hiking, I reached the trailhead. There were a few cars there, and I felt a wave of relief at seeing other people. I got into my car and locked the doors, taking deep breaths and trying to calm myself. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but the road was empty. I called the local ranger station as soon as I got signal and reported what had happened, describing the footprints and the scratches on the trees. They said they would send someone to check the area. That night, in my own home, I couldn't sleep easily. I kept thinking about the figure in the forest and how silently it had moved, how deliberate it had been. The experience left a lasting mark on me, but I also felt grateful. I had taken precautions, I had stayed calm, and I had survived without confrontation. I realized that camping in isolation had risks I hadn't fully appreciated before, and from then on, I made a rule. No more solo camping in unknown forests. Always tell someone your plan, always carry enough protection, and always be aware of your surroundings. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the forest, but never the same part, never alone. I spoke with other hikers who had been in that area and discovered that there had been reports of people, possibly poachers or squatters, moving silently through the woods. The forest wasn't haunted. There were no ghosts, but it was unpredictable, and it demanded respect. I learned that nature can be dangerous in ways that are simple and real, through people, through animals, through the terrain itself. The experience changed how I approached wilderness, making me more careful, more observant, and more aware of the reality that isolation can bring unexpected danger. I still go camping now, but always in groups, always with a plan, and always knowing the exact trails and terrain. The forest taught me a lesson about fear, vigilance, and respect. The fear I felt that night was raw, human, and real, and the clarity I gained afterward has stayed with me ever since. I survived because I stayed calm, because I paid attention, and because I respected the forest and its unpredictable nature. That weekend trip was supposed to be a simple escape, but it became one of the most intense experiences of my life. One that I remember vividly every time I pack a backpack and step into the woods again. I had been planning this camping trip for months, carefully choosing a remote area deep in the mountains where the fewest people would ever pass. I wanted solitude, silence, and a break from the constant noise of the city. I had been camping before, but never alone, and I wanted this to be a challenge. I drove my old SUV up narrow, winding roads, past forests that thickened as I climbed higher. The air was cooler here, fresher, carrying the smell of wet pine and damp earth. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a narrow stream, where I decided to set up my tent. I unloaded my gear: a heavy-duty tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, a few cans of food, water bottles, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a sturdy backpack. Everything was meticulously planned. I pitched the tent on flat ground, avoiding tree roots and low-hanging branches. The ground was damp but firm. I found a small pile of dry sticks nearby for a fire, gathering more wood than I thought I would need. As I set up, the sun was already lowering behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled of moss and wet leaves, and the only sounds were the faint rush of the stream and the distant calls of birds. By the time I finished, twilight was creeping in. I made a small fire in a ring of stones I had cleared, the flames crackling, giving off warmth and light. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans heated over the stove, and sipped water from my bottle. The forest around me felt quiet, but in that quiet, I sensed life. Not human life, but animal life. Rustling in the underbrush, branches snapping in the distance, and the low hum of insects starting their evening chorus. Night fell fast. The darkness was absolute once the sun disappeared. I had brought a lantern, but I didn't want to use it, preferring the darkness. It was easier to spot movement by contrast than to sit in constant artificial light. The fire was small but steady, the smoke curling into the night sky. I stayed alert, scanning the perimeter with my flashlight periodically, though I saw nothing more than the faint shapes of trees. I went to bed early, wrapping myself tightly in the sleeping bag, placing my pocket knife and flashlight within reach. I fell asleep to the sound of the stream, but the forest never really sleeps. Hours later, I woke abruptly. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above, making the shadows shift unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A series of deliberate, slow snaps coming from the trees just beyond the clearing. Branches breaking one at a time. No hurry, just a steady progression toward my campsite. I froze, listening. I couldn't see anything, just darkness beyond the small circle illuminated by the dying embers. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing, but the sound continued, moving closer. My stomach dropped. I had prepared for wildlife encounters, a bear, a mountain lion, but this didn't sound like that. Bears break branches by accident. This sounded intentional. I checked my knife. It was a solid blade, but in total darkness, I felt completely exposed. I decided to stay put. I fed the fire more wood, letting it burn higher. The sounds stopped. I sat, flashlight in hand, staring into the shadows, every muscle tense. Minutes passed, or maybe an hour. It was hard to tell. Then, a new sound, a low growl, not from a dog or wolf, but from something large. My mind raced through possibilities: bears, mountain lions, even wild dogs. I had researched the area, and while bears were possible, they usually didn't approach humans this closely. My heart pounded. My hands shook as I fumbled with my flashlight. The beam revealed nothing, but shadows moved with every flicker. I realized my phone had no signal. I had thought I might be able to call for help, but in this remote spot, I was alone. My best option was to stay calm and wait for daylight. I piled more wood on the fire, keeping it high, and sat close, holding my knife across my lap. Every sound in the forest became magnified. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the occasional thud that could have been a falling branch or something else. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that animals were probably just curious or fighting each other, but deep down, I knew something was nearby, something that didn't want me there. The night stretched on. Sleep was impossible. I remained awake, fire at the center of my attention, listening and watching. Sometimes the snaps would start again, closer this time, then retreat, then circle. My nerves frayed. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, just a fleeting shape between trees, but it was enough to make my stomach knot. I couldn't see it clearly, couldn't tell what it was, but my instincts screamed at me. Danger. Hours passed. The fire dwindled, and the cold seeped into my bones. I decided I couldn't just sit there. I had to take action. I gathered my flashlight, knife, and backpack, and quietly started moving toward my SUV, parked a few hundred feet down a dirt track. I moved slowly, scanning the darkness. Every shadow looked alive. Every sound made me jump. At one point, a branch snapped close behind me. I spun around with flashlight and knife, heart in my throat, but again, nothing. I forced myself to keep moving. I reached the SUV. My hands shook as I unlocked the doors, sliding into the driver's seat. The engine started on the first try, and I exhaled slowly, letting the sound mask my own racing heartbeat. I stayed there for a while, listening. The forest seemed to watch me, silent now, though I knew the shadows hadn't gone. I needed to leave. I knew the roads were narrow, winding, and I had to drive carefully to avoid an accident. But staying in the SUV was safer than the dark, unknown forest. At first light, I drove slowly down the mountain. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses of shapes moving among the trees. Large animals, maybe bears, following the edges of the road. I didn't stop to look too closely. I just drove, careful not to attract attention. The forest seemed endless, the mountains unbroken, until finally, I reached a spot where the trees thinned, and I could see houses in the valley below. My phone found a signal. I called the local ranger station, explaining what had happened. They told me it was rare, but bears and mountain lions sometimes moved close to campsites at night, especially if they smelled food. I reported my campsite location and described the sounds I heard. The rangers advised me never to camp alone in that area again, to always make noise at night, and to keep fires high. I drove home slowly, exhausted, tense, my mind replaying every sound, every movement from the night before. In the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about how vulnerable I had been. The forest, so beautiful in daylight, held dangers I hadn't considered. I began studying animal behavior more carefully, understanding tracks, listening for warning signs, and learning how to avoid attracting predators. I realized that even well-prepared humans were not always safe in the wilderness, and that caution, respect, and awareness were as important as any gear. Months later, I returned to the area, but not alone. I joined a small, guided camping group, sticking to designated paths and campsites. The memories of that night stayed with me. I knew that in the wilderness, the darkness was alive, full of creatures that could kill without hesitation, and humans were not always the dominant presence. I learned to sleep lightly, always aware of the sounds around me, always keeping a fire ready, and always respecting the silent rules of the forest. That experience changed how I approached camping, how I traveled, and how I prepared. I understood that fear was a natural response, a tool to keep me alive, and that the forest was not something to conquer, but something to coexist with carefully. That trip, that terrifying night, had taught me more about survival, about respect, and about the fragility of human life than any book or guide ever could. I had been planning the trip for months. After months of staring at the same walls, hearing the same city noise, and feeling the same sense of emptiness that the city always carried with it, I decided I needed a break, a real escape. Not a vacation where I would be surrounded by tourists, overpriced meals, and endless traffic, but a real retreat into the wilderness. The forest always seemed like the kind of place where one could disappear, at least mentally, from the constant demands of life. I wanted isolation, silence, and the chance to feel what it was like to depend entirely on myself. That's how I found myself, one early Friday morning, loading my car with a backpack heavier than I expected. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and enough food for 5 days. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through roads that seemed to get narrower and rougher the deeper I went into the mountains. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was climbing higher in the sky, and the air smelled different, cleaner, fresher, tinged with pine. I had checked the trail map several times, memorizing each turn and landmark. My plan was to hike in, set up camp at a spot near a small creek, and spend the next few days alone in the woods, just me, my supplies, and the quiet. I was not inexperienced. I had done smaller trips before, and I had read about survival in the wilderness, so I felt confident I could handle myself. I also knew that things could go wrong. That was part of why I liked it. The unpredictability made it feel alive. The trail began gently, a narrow dirt path with roots and small rocks scattered across it. The forest around me was dense, a mixture of fir, spruce, and birch, with sunlight filtering through the branches in dappled patterns. Birds called from above, and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth told me I was not entirely alone. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I walked steadily, keeping my pace consistent, stopping occasionally to drink water or adjust my pack. The forest was quiet in a way the city never was, not oppressive, but alive. I noticed the scent of damp soil, moss, and decaying leaves. I noticed the way the light shifted as clouds passed overhead. It was peaceful, but I also felt that underlying tension that comes with being somewhere you are entirely responsible for yourself. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had identified on my map. A small clearing opened beside a creek, the water moving over smooth stones with a soft, steady sound. It was perfect. I dropped my backpack, unrolled my sleeping bag, and began setting up the tent. The work was methodical, almost meditative. I pegged down the corners, secured the guy lines, and made sure everything was tight and stable. When the tent was up, I set up a small area for cooking, gathering some fallen branches for firewood. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This was exactly what I wanted. I made a simple dinner on my small stove. Instant noodles with a few dried vegetables I had packed, eating slowly, savoring the silence. The creek's water ran beside me, its gurgle the only sound besides the occasional bird call or the rustle of a squirrel in the trees. I washed my dishes in the creek and hung them on a branch to dry, then crawled into my tent. It was still light enough to see through the thin nylon walls, but darkness was coming fast. I lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the forest, feeling that sense of isolation settle over me. It was comforting, but it also carried a weight. In the city, you are never truly alone. Here, even a small mistake could become serious. Night fell completely, and the forest transformed. The sounds changed, too. The nocturnal creatures became active, owls calling from hidden perches, insects chirping incessantly, and small animals moving through the underbrush. I had always enjoyed camping, but there was something different about this night. The world felt larger than it did in daylight, and I felt a creeping awareness of how tiny I was in comparison. I could hear the creek more distinctly now, the water louder, rushing over rocks I could not see. I fell asleep slowly, half listening, half dreaming. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound that froze me in place. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind, just a low, deliberate snapping of twigs somewhere close. Not hundreds of feet away, much closer. My heart rate jumped. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The snapping continued, slowly, methodically, coming from the direction of my tent. I had my flashlight beside me, and I reached for it carefully, turning it on just enough to illuminate the tent walls. The light didn't show anything, but the sound didn't stop. Something, or someone, was moving outside, circling the tent. My stomach tightened. I had not expected anyone else to be in these woods at this hour. It was remote, too remote for a casual hiker. I realized immediately that I had no way of knowing who it could be or what their intentions were. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, counting every sound, every break of a branch, every rustle. Then it came, something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth around the tent. They were too heavy to be an animal. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I considered yelling, but there was no one around to hear except the person outside. I considered running, but the woods were pitch black, and without knowing the direction, I could easily get lost or injured. I could hear the person's movements circling the tent. They paused sometimes, the silence stretching uncomfortably, and I felt certain they were listening, too. I remembered the small knife in my backpack and reached for it quietly. My hands were shaking, but I gripped it tightly. I also remembered my phone in my pocket. I didn't have reception, but I could call emergency services if I got close enough to the edge of the trail. For now, though, I had to stay hidden and quiet. I held the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other, listening. The footsteps eventually moved away from the tent, but I did not move. I did not breathe loudly. I waited for what felt like an eternity, until finally the forest seemed to settle again. The creek's gurgle, the insect hum, the distant call of an owl. It was all the same as before, yet the tension remained. By morning, I was exhausted and unnerved. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, scanning the area. There were fresh footprints in the soft earth near my tent. They were large, booted prints, not small like mine. They had circled the tent, then disappeared into the trees. I felt a mix of relief and fear. Someone had been here, clearly, and they had been deliberate, circling my tent in the middle of the night. But they were gone, at least for now. I packed up my tent quickly, decided not to linger near the creek, and started hiking back toward the trailhead, keeping my senses alert. Every shadow, every sound, every rustle made my heart jump. The hike back was tense. I kept imagining someone following me, hiding behind trees, waiting for me to let my guard down. Every time I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, I froze. I clutched my knife, keeping it ready. I also began thinking rationally, reminding myself that most encounters in the wilderness are not violent. Most people are alone because they are hiking or camping responsibly. But this person had been circling my tent, intentionally, in the middle of the night. That changed the equation. By late morning, I finally reached a point where I felt safer. A more open section of the trail where I could see far ahead and behind. I slowed my pace slightly, breathing more easily, allowing my mind to relax just a fraction. The thought of getting back to civilization, even just to the parking lot, was becoming my only focus. Eventually, after hours that felt endless, I reached the trailhead. There were cars parked, hikers walking in both directions, and the sound of engines and human voices. I felt relief wash over me in a way that was almost physical. I was not completely safe, but at least I was no longer alone in the wilderness with someone who had clearly been following me. I loaded my gear into my car, shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me down the road. But the road was empty. The forest stretched behind me, quiet, unchanged, but I knew I would never look at it the same way again. That night, I realized something fundamental about being alone in the wilderness. The danger is not always from animals or the terrain. Sometimes it comes from other humans. That thought stayed with me for days, shaping the way I moved, the way I thought about solitude. When I finally returned home, I spent hours cleaning and organizing my gear. I thought about reporting the incident to authorities, but I knew there was little they could do with so little information. All I had were footprints and the memory of footsteps circling my tent. Still, I filed a report and shared the experience with a few close friends, warning them about the unpredictability of isolation. I realized I had underestimated the wilderness in a different way, not its natural dangers, but the way it exposes human vulnerability. The next time I planned a trip, I made sure to hike with a companion, to set up my camp in more visible areas, and to have emergency communication devices ready. The experience left me more cautious but also more aware of myself. I learned how quickly fear can take hold when you are entirely dependent on your own instincts, and how carefully observation and patience can keep you safe. That summer, I returned to the same general area, this time with a friend, and the woods felt different. I noticed the details I had ignored before: the sound of a creek, the smell of damp pine, the patterns of light on the forest floor. But the sense of danger lingered, always a faint shadow at the edge of perception. I never saw the person again, and I never found out who they were, but the memory of that night stayed vivid, a reminder that isolation in the wilderness is both beautiful and unpredictable, and that being prepared can make the difference between safety and disaster. Even months later, I still remembered the quiet snap of the twigs, the deliberate pacing outside my tent, and the way my heartbeat had echoed in my ears. It was not a story of monsters or ghosts. It was real, human, and terrifyingly close. But in the end, I survived, learned, and returned with a clearer understanding of the wilderness and myself. The memory became a kind of benchmark for my resilience, a night that tested my awareness, my instincts, and my ability to stay calm under pressure. And for all its fear, it became part of the reason I continued to camp, hike, and explore the wild, always with respect, caution, and preparation, knowing now that the most unexpected dangers are often human, not natural. I had been planning the camping trip for months, carefully studying maps, trail guides, and weather patterns. I wanted a solo trip, away from the crowds, away from cell service, away from everything. The forest I chose was a remote stretch of wilderness that few people ventured into, a place where the trees grew tall and close together, and the underbrush was thick and tangled. It was early September, and the days were still warm, but the nights were already starting to chill. I packed my gear meticulously, double-checking that I had enough food, water, and first aid supplies. My backpack was heavy, but I liked that. It made me feel prepared, responsible, and cautious. I left the car at a small gravel pull-off near the trailhead, locking it carefully. I was ready to walk deep into the forest, where I could set up camp far from the trail and experience real solitude. The first hours of hiking were pleasant. The trail wound through pine trees and birch, the sunlight streaking through branches in golden beams. Birds called in the distance, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at deer or small mammals going about their day. I felt alert but calm, moving steadily along the narrow, uneven trail. I took care to place my feet carefully, knowing that twisted roots and loose rocks could easily cause a sprained ankle far from help. Every so often, I stopped to check my map and compass, ensuring I was heading toward the area I had marked as my intended campsite. By late afternoon, I had left the main trail entirely. The path became less defined, turning into a faint set of depressions in the forest floor. I could tell that few people had passed this way. The air felt different here, darker, cooler, denser. The trees grew so close together that the sunlight barely touched the ground, and the moss-covered roots made every step uncertain. I kept moving, pushing through low-hanging branches and spiderwebs, until I found a small clearing I thought would make a decent campsite. It was surrounded on all sides by thick forest, and a fallen log offered some shelter and a place to rest. I set to work unpacking my gear, laying down a tarp, and pitching my small tent. The effort required more strength than I expected. The roots and uneven ground made staking the tent tricky, but I managed. Once it was secure, I began gathering firewood. The forest floor was damp in places, but I was able to find dry sticks beneath overhanging logs and tree limbs. I built a small fire pit and lit it carefully, sitting back as the flames began to dance and crackle. The smell of burning wood and the gentle warmth of the fire comforted me. As evening approached, the forest began to change. The birds quieted, and the shadows lengthened. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the wind shifted to carry a chill through the trees. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, eating slowly and deliberately, savoring the quiet and the isolation. But as darkness fell, I felt a creeping unease. The forest was no longer just quiet, it was expectant. The sounds of small animals and insects became sharper and more noticeable. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me flinch. I reminded myself that this was normal, that I was deep in the wilderness and every creature was active at night, but my stomach tightened anyway. Around 9 p.m., I extinguished the fire almost completely, leaving only a few glowing embers, and settled into my tent. The sounds outside were constant. The wind brushing against branches, small animals foraging, and something heavier, a low, distant thump that could have been a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. I tried to relax, telling myself I was overthinking it, but sleep did not come easily. I found myself lying awake for hours, listening to the forest in a way I never had before. At some point during the night, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was not the typical noise of the forest. It was deliberate, measured footsteps, crunching over leaves and twigs, coming closer to my tent. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then resumed a moment later, circling the clearing slowly. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to breathe steadily. I told myself it was probably another camper or a ranger, someone passing through, but the thought offered little comfort. The footsteps were too deliberate, too careful, too human. But there was no light, no shadow, nothing to confirm what I feared. I stayed in the tent, lying perfectly still, waiting for hours until the sounds faded. The fear made sleep impossible. When the first hints of dawn appeared, I carefully unzipped my tent and stepped outside, scanning the surrounding trees. There were no signs of anyone. No footprints, no trash, no indications that anyone had been here at all. My unease lingered, but the light of morning offered some relief. I decided to pack up quickly. The thought of staying another night in that clearing was unbearable. As I hiked back toward the main trail, I kept my eyes and ears open, constantly checking for movement or sound. Every rustle in the underbrush made my stomach churn. The forest that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt suffocating, hostile. I moved faster, using my compass to guide me, and after several hours, I finally broke through to a better traveled path. The relief was immense. I kept walking until I reached my car, exhausted, tense, and trembling. I locked the doors behind me, sat inside, and let myself breathe for the first time in hours. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I could not shake the feeling that someone, or something human, had been watching me that night. The forest had felt alive in a new, menacing way, and I realized that isolation in the wilderness was a double-edged sword. It offered peace and solitude, but it also stripped away the safety of proximity to others. Eventually, I returned to the area, but only with a group of friends and after carefully marking a safer, more visible campsite. I brought walkie-talkies, extra lights, and made sure we were never out of each other's sight. We spent the days hiking and exploring, but I stayed alert, constantly aware of my surroundings, listening for sounds that might indicate another human presence. The forest, once terrifying in its quiet, became more manageable when shared with others. I learned several lessons from that trip. Preparation is essential, but it is not enough to protect against the unknown presence of others in remote areas. Awareness of surroundings, early planning of escape routes, and maintaining the ability to leave quickly are vital. Solitude in nature can be beautiful, but it can also make you vulnerable in ways that few anticipate. The fear I experienced that night was real, grounded entirely in natural human instincts. It was not a ghost or a monster. It was the very real risk posed by another human with unknown intentions. That trip changed the way I approached the wilderness forever. I never camped alone in such remote areas again. I became meticulous about informing someone of my location, carrying communication devices, and always keeping an escape plan in mind. I learned to read the signs of human presence. Footprints, discarded items, broken branches, altered underbrush, and to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. Nature is not inherently frightening, but people can be, and in isolation, there is no one to help you but yourself. The lessons I took away were clear and practical. Fear is a tool. It sharpens awareness and encourages caution. Solitude can teach resilience, but it also exposes vulnerability. Preparation, observation, and respect for both nature and the potential danger posed by other humans are essential. I never forgot the sound of those footsteps circling my tent, nor the paralyzing dread of being watched in the dark. That memory stayed with me, a reminder of the delicate balance between adventure and survival. Years later, I would hike through that forest again, but never alone. I would guide friends and strangers safely through the trails, sharing my experience to emphasize respect for the wilderness and caution regarding isolation. Each hike was planned carefully, each campsite chosen deliberately, each night approached with mindfulness and vigilance. I could enjoy the beauty of the forest without succumbing to the paralyzing fear I had felt on that first solo trip, but the memory remained as a reminder that the wilderness can be unforgiving and unpredictable, not because of supernatural forces, but because it exposes the raw realities of isolation and human vulnerability. In the end, the experience left me wiser, more cautious, and more respectful of the natural world. I carried those lessons into every hike, every camping trip, and every outdoor adventure thereafter. The forest remained a place of beauty, but it was also a place of awareness, vigilance, and humility. I never sought solitude in the deep wilderness again, but I never lost my love for it either. The story of that night became part of my personal guidebook for survival, practical, realistic, and grounded in experience. The fear I faced was real, but it was overcome by preparation, awareness, and careful action. That clarity and the lessons I carried with me were, in themselves, a form of peace. I had always enjoyed camping alone. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet satisfaction in the way I could pack my gear, hike into a remote area, and be completely responsible for my own survival for a few days. I had grown up camping with my family, and over the years, I had learned not just to survive, but to thrive in the wilderness. The smell of damp pine needles, the sound of wind through the trees, the distant call of birds, and even the low growl of some unseen animal all felt natural to me. It was peaceful until it wasn't. This trip started like any other. I drove to a trailhead in a national forest I had never explored before. I had picked it because it promised isolation. Miles of trails winding through dense woods, a few small streams, and no record of heavy human traffic. I parked my car on a dirt pull-off, double-checked my pack, and began the hike. The air was crisp and cool for late fall, with a biting edge that made me pull my jacket tighter around my torso. Leaves crunched under my boots as I followed the trail. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the trees, creating dark patches between the golden leaves. The hike was longer than I had expected. The trail twisted through thick undergrowth, crossed several small creeks, and climbed gently over rolling hills. I paused often to rest, drink water, and take in the landscape. I was carrying a heavy pack, loaded with food, a tent, sleeping bag, stove, and extra layers. I had planned for 3 nights in total, and I wanted to be thorough. The first night, I found a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and there was a gentle slope leading to a tiny creek 100 feet away. Felt perfect. I set up my tent carefully, pegging it firmly and staking the corners, then collected firewood from the surrounding area. Small branches for kindling, larger sticks for sustaining the fire. I made sure the fire was well contained in a circle of stones I had found nearby. Flames licked the dry wood, spitting small sparks into the night sky. I cooked my meal, ate slowly, and enjoyed the silence. The forest felt alive but not threatening. I lay in my sleeping bag afterward, listening to the subtle sounds of night, the wind in the trees, the water in the creek, the occasional snap of a branch as some small animal moved through the underbrush. I felt at ease, and eventually, I drifted into a deep sleep. The second day, I decided to hike further, deeper into the forest. The trails became narrower, more overgrown, and eventually, they disappeared entirely. I relied on my map and compass, marking my progress carefully. By midday, I had reached a ridge overlooking a small valley, where I discovered a partially hidden side trail leading down to a flat area that looked perfect for camping. The location was isolated, surrounded by thick trees, with the creek running nearby. I had never seen another person in this part of the forest. I unpacked, set up my tent, and began to collect firewood. As evening fell, the forest changed. Shadows grew longer, stretching across the clearing like fingers. The wind picked up, and with it came a strange sense of movement. The creek gurgled more loudly, and the trees seemed to creak under their own weight. I tried to focus on my tasks, splitting wood and preparing food, but something felt different. A few leaves rustled in a way that didn't match the wind. My stomach tightened. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, being alone in the woods could play tricks on your mind. That night, I lay in my tent trying to sleep. I had never had trouble with wild animals, but this night was different. Every little noise seemed amplified. A branch cracked. A deer ran somewhere beyond my sight. The creek whispered. Hours passed, and the sounds never stopped. The constant noise gnawed at my concentration. I felt exposed, isolated, and small. The darkness outside the thin walls of my tent felt endless. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I slept fitfully. The next morning, I woke early and noticed something odd. My food bag, which I had hung from a tree about 10 feet from my tent, was slightly lower than I remembered. I inspected it carefully. No food was missing, but the rope looked disturbed, as if it had been nudged or pulled. I scanned the surrounding area but saw no footprints, no signs of animals that could have reached it. My mind started racing with possibilities. Raccoons, bears, or some human presence. I shook it off. It had to be an animal. I packed my things and decided to explore the valley. As I walked, I noticed more signs of activity. Small disturbances in the undergrowth, flattened grass patches near the creek, and broken twigs. Nothing screamed danger, but the subtle evidence of movement kept my senses on high alert. I moved carefully, scanning every shadow, every corner. I was hyper-aware of every sound, the whisper of leaves, the distant roar of water, the occasional flutter of wings. By late afternoon, I returned to my campsite. The sun was starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows and bathing the forest in an orange glow. I collected more firewood, knowing I needed a strong fire for the night. As I worked, I noticed something else. Small scratches on my tent stakes, marks I hadn't seen before. They weren't deep, but deliberate. Someone or something had touched my campsite while I was away. Fear settled in. Up until this point, I had assumed I was alone, that the forest was just wild and indifferent. But now, the possibility of a human intruder made everything different. I reinforced my tent, ensuring the stakes were secure and the entrance zipped tightly. I kept my knife close, my flashlight within reach, and I stayed alert. I started to think like someone hiding in plain sight. Every rustle could be an animal or a person. Every shadow might conceal someone. Night fell, and the forest became a different place entirely. I kept the fire small but constant, a glowing barrier against the darkness. I stayed awake, watching, listening, tensing with every sound. Hours passed slowly. The wind shifted, carrying new noises. Faint snapping of branches from a distance, a muffled shuffle, something scraping against a tree trunk. My heart raced. I held my knife, ready for whatever it might be. Eventually, the noises subsided, and dawn came. The forest seemed calm, almost ordinary again. I didn't relax entirely, but daylight brought clarity. I decided to break camp early. Packing up took longer than usual because I inspected everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, firewood carefully. I didn't leave anything behind, and I made sure no trace of my presence lingered, in case someone had been following. I started my hike out, sticking strictly to the trail. I kept my senses sharp. Every sound, every movement was scrutinized. Hours passed, and I made steady progress. The forest opened slightly as I descended from the ridge. I felt a growing relief with every step. Eventually, I reached the main trail. There were footprints here, my own and others worn into the dirt, but they were consistent with normal hikers, not the subtle intrusions I had noticed. By late afternoon, I reached my car. Relief washed over me, heavier than I expected. I inspected the car, everything intact. I sat for a while, taking deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. I realized how close I might have been to a dangerous situation. Someone, or something, had been near my campsite, and I had no way of knowing how long it had been watching or what its intentions were. On the drive home, I thought through every detail, every small sign I had missed. I understood something vital. The forest is indifferent, but humans are unpredictable. Isolation can be peaceful, but it can also expose you to risks you might not anticipate. That day, I had experienced fear in a raw, tangible form, one not born of stories or imagination but real-life vulnerability. Once home, I took steps to process the experience. I documented everything in my journal, from the location and time to the subtle disturbances I had observed. I analyzed possible scenarios and concluded that the safest assumption was a human presence, likely another hiker or camper who had trespassed on my area. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that preparation is not just about surviving nature, but about being aware of other humans. After a few days, I returned to the same forest, but to a different area with more people around. This time, I stayed alert but did not feel the same deep fear. I learned to respect the isolation, but also to respect the unpredictability of strangers in remote places. The lessons from that trip stayed with me for years. Never take solitude for granted, always secure your campsite, and trust your instincts. In the end, I survived not because of luck, but because of vigilance, preparation, and careful attention to every detail. Even now, when I think back, the memory of those nights, the darkness pressing in, the rustle of leaves, the unseen presence, sends a shiver down my spine. But it also reminds me of my own resilience, of the ability to navigate fear, to respond calmly under pressure, and to leave a dangerous situation intact. That trip taught me a simple but profound truth. The wilderness is beautiful and terrifying at once, and the real danger is not always animals or weather, but the unknown human element. I learned to respect both, and to emerge from the experience with a clear mind, a cautious heart, and a strengthened sense of self. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. The idea of disconnecting from everything, my phone, the city, even the faint hum of electricity, was incredibly appealing. I wanted to be alone with the forest, to test myself in the wilderness and see how far I could push my own limits. I chose a remote area deep in the mountains that I had only seen on maps. It was far from main roads, unmarked trails, and any signs of human life for miles. The isolation was exactly what I was looking for, but it would soon become a source of fear I hadn't anticipated. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was climbing high into the sky. The air was crisp and dry, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth from the previous night's rain. My pack felt heavy against my shoulders, loaded with the essentials. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, water, food, a first aid kit, and a few tools I thought I might need. The trail was narrow and rugged, with tree roots and rocks jutting out like obstacles, and a layer of fallen leaves that made every step uncertain. My boots sank slightly with each step, and I could hear the distant cry of a hawk circling above. The forest felt alive, but in a way that was both beautiful and intimidating. The first few miles were straightforward. I followed a faint dirt trail that twisted through the thick trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches in streaks, highlighting patches of moss and small wildflowers that grew along the edges. Occasionally, I would see a squirrel or a rabbit darting across the path, disappearing into the underbrush. I took my time, wanting to enjoy the quiet and not rush into the deeper parts of the wilderness too quickly. I had chosen a spot near a small stream I had seen marked on the topographic map, thinking it would be a good place to set up camp. Water nearby always felt like a safety net. It meant I could stay hydrated and have some comfort without traveling back to a main water source. After about 4 hours of hiking, the trail began to disappear under thicker growth. Trees grew closer together, their branches tangling overhead. The sunlight dimmed considerably, and the forest floor became uneven and treacherous. I had to pay close attention to my footing. Every so often, I paused to rest and drink water. My legs were sore, but my spirits were high. The isolation was thrilling, and the idea that I was the only person for miles in any direction made me feel alive. By late afternoon, I reached the small stream. It was narrower than I had expected, but it ran clear and cold, tumbling over stones and fallen branches. I scouted the area for a campsite and found a small clearing just beyond the stream. The ground was relatively flat, though covered in a thick layer of pine needles. It seemed perfect. I unpacked my gear and began setting up the tent. It took a while because the ground was hard in spots and covered with tangled roots, but eventually I had a small, secure shelter. I moved my pack inside and arranged my stove and supplies. By the time the tent was fully set up, the sun had begun to lower behind the ridges, and shadows crept across the forest. I started a small fire to cook dinner, carefully arranging stones around the edges to prevent it from spreading. The crackle of the flames and the smell of burning wood were comforting, but I also felt an awareness of how quickly things could go wrong out here. Wildfires were a real threat, and I made sure to keep water close and the fire manageable. After dinner, I cleaned up and stored all food securely in my backpack, knowing the smell could attract animals. I also made sure to hang my bag from a sturdy tree branch, about 10 feet off the ground, just in case any curious wildlife came near. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. What had felt peaceful in daylight became ominous. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me tense. I lay in my sleeping bag inside the tent, flashlight at the ready, listening to the night sounds. Owls called somewhere in the distance. An occasional rustle of small creatures moving in the underbrush made my heart beat a little faster. I reminded myself that I had experienced hiking in the dark before, that I was prepared, and that this was natural. Still, there was an undeniable edge to the silence outside. It wasn't a complete silence, but a kind of waiting quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I slept fitfully, waking occasionally to strange sounds outside. At first light, I unzipped the tent and saw the early morning fog curling around the trees. The air was colder than I expected, and I pulled my jacket tighter. I ate a small breakfast and planned to explore a little before packing up. I wanted to see more of the stream and perhaps follow it to where it widened. The terrain was rough, but I was careful, moving slowly and deliberately, keeping my balance. About 2 miles upstream, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The ground was disturbed, like something had been dragged across it. The marks were fresh, and I realized with a jolt that they could have been made by a larger animal, perhaps a deer or even a bear. My immediate thought was to leave, but I had no way to quickly exit the area. The trails I had used yesterday were now further behind me, and I had ventured into unmarked territory. I retraced my steps back to the campsite, feeling uneasy. The forest no longer seemed like a beautiful escape. It felt unpredictable and dangerous. I decided to move my campsite slightly, closer to the stream, and higher up on a small slope. I packed everything carefully and kept my firewood separate, just in case I needed to leave in a hurry. As I was setting up, I heard a low growl from across the stream. My heart stopped. I froze, trying to identify the sound. It was deep, and the echo through the trees was unsettling. It didn't sound like a coyote or a wolf. It was heavier, closer to a bear. I stayed perfectly still for what felt like forever. Then, the sound faded, leaving only the forest noises. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was probably a bear passing far enough away not to pose a threat if I stayed calm. But every muscle in my body was tense. I checked my food storage again, making sure everything was secure, and kept a long branch close to me for protection. The next day, I decided to hike to a ridge I had seen marked on the map. From there, I could see a broader view of the area, which might help me feel less trapped. The climb was steep, and the forest became dense. I was constantly checking for any signs of wildlife. Around midday, I spotted tracks, large paw prints in soft mud near the stream. They were fresh. My pulse quickened, and I realized I had been too careless venturing upstream. The prints led in the same direction I was heading. I debated turning back, but the ridge wasn't far. I quickened my pace, keeping my senses alert. Every rustle made me flinch. Birds flew up suddenly, startled by something unseen. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge. The view was breathtaking. valleys stretching out in every direction, ridges layered behind each other, trees forming an unbroken green sea. But the sense of safety was fleeting. I realized that while I could see for miles, I was still isolated. If anything went wrong, there was no immediate help. I took some photos and marked my location on the map, noting the safest path back to my campsite. Then I descended carefully, choosing a slower pace to reduce the chance of slipping or falling. That evening, I decided not to go far from my tent. I built a small fire and remained vigilant, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I heard it again, the low growl closer this time, followed by the snapping of branches. My mind raced. I kept calm, reminding myself not to panic. I turned on a small flashlight, scanning the area. I thought I saw movement, a dark shape moving slowly among the trees across the stream. I knew bears could be extremely dangerous, especially at night, and I decided to stay inside the tent, keeping the flashlight handy and the branch close. I tried to sleep, but the fear made it nearly impossible. I stayed awake, listening, waiting, until the first light of dawn. The next morning, I decided I had stayed long enough. My gear was packed tightly, the camp cleared, and the fire completely out. I planned a safe, deliberate route back to the trailhead. I kept a close eye on the tracks and signs of wildlife as I moved. Each sound in the forest made me tense, but I stayed focused. Around midday, I crossed the stream for the last time and saw signs of human activity ahead. Old footprints, a worn path. Relief flooded through me. By late afternoon, I emerged back onto the main trail, exhausted, sweaty, and sore, but safe. Looking back at the forest from the edge of the trailhead, I realized how unpredictable and raw nature could be. It was beautiful, but it was indifferent, and it demanded respect. I had faced real fear, not from ghosts or legends, but from the simple reality of being alone in the wilderness with potentially dangerous animals and unpredictable terrain. My experience had been terrifying, but I had survived through vigilance, preparation, and calm decision-making. By the time I drove back to civilization, I felt an odd mixture of relief and pride. I had tested myself in isolation and faced real danger without panicking. I promised myself I would return someday, but better prepared, with more knowledge of wildlife patterns and safety measures. That trip taught me the real meaning of caution, respect, and survival. The forest was not a storybook. It was real, unforgiving, and beautiful, and I had come out of it wiser and more aware. I had been planning this camping trip for months, thinking it would be a simple escape into nature, a weekend away from the noise of the city and the constant hum of obligations. I wanted quiet, isolation, the smell of pine in the air, and the rhythmic rustle of leaves. I didn't want to go too far, just a forest I had read about in some old hiking forums. People said it was remote, but not impossible to navigate. The trailhead was a 2-hour drive from my apartment, and I left early in the morning, carrying a backpack that felt heavier than I expected. It had everything I thought I might need: a small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, extra clothes, a first aid kit, a few cans of food, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I didn't bring much else. I told myself I would rely on the forest, on the streams for water, and the few emergency supplies I had packed. The drive itself was uneventful, quiet except for the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional radio station I cycled through. When I finally arrived at the trailhead, the forest loomed before me like a living wall. Tall pines lined the dirt path, and the air was cool and sharp. The parking lot was empty except for one other car, an older SUV that looked like it had been through a few off-road adventures. I didn't think much of it at the time. I slung my pack over my shoulders and began walking, the crunch of gravel under my boots marking each step. The path started easy, a wide trail that gradually narrowed as I moved deeper into the forest. I noticed small details, the way the sunlight hit the tops of the trees, casting patterns onto the forest floor, the occasional bird hopping from branch to branch, and the distant sound of running water. I felt calm, even excited. The further I walked, the more removed I felt from the world I had left behind, and that was exactly what I had hoped for. After about an hour of steady walking, I found a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there were no signs of anyone else camping nearby. I decided it was a good place to set up my tent. The clearing was big enough to give me a sense of space, yet enclosed enough that the surrounding trees offered some privacy and protection. I unpacked my gear and started setting up the tent, hammering the stakes into the ground with more effort than I anticipated. Sweat ran down my back, and I realized I had underestimated how much energy it would take to carry all my gear this far into the forest. Once the tent was up, I arranged my sleeping bag inside and stored my food in a small waterproof container, away from the tent. I followed the basic rules I had read online. Keep everything that smelled edible away from the sleeping area to avoid attracting wildlife. I had seen videos of bears in the forest, and although I told myself this area was safe, the thought lingered. I decided to take a short walk along the stream before nightfall, partly to get my bearings, partly to enjoy the fading light. The stream was shallow but clear. I could see small fish darting beneath the surface, and the rocks made the water shimmer as the sun sank lower behind the trees. I knelt to take a drink directly from the stream after filtering it through my portable device. The water was cold and fresh, and it gave me a small boost of energy. I explored the banks for a while, noticing tracks in the mud. Small animal footprints at first, maybe raccoons or deer, but then larger ones, ambiguous enough to make me pause. I traced the prints for a few meters, trying to tell if they belonged to a bear, but they seemed old. The mud hardened in the warm afternoon sun. I shrugged it off and returned to the clearing as the shadows lengthened. As night began to fall, I started a small campfire using dry twigs and branches I had collected. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, a reminder that I was in control, that I could survive in this environment if I stayed careful. I cooked a can of beans over the flames, the smell of heated food filling the clearing. Sitting on a log with the fire in front of me, I listened to the forest. The birds had gone silent, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the whisper of wind through the trees. For a long moment, I felt perfectly content. Then I heard it, a snap, like someone stepping on a dry branch. I froze, listening intently. My heart rate quickened, and I scanned the shadows beyond the firelight. Nothing moved, yet the sound had come from somewhere nearby, maybe 50 feet from where I sat. I told myself it was probably a deer or another small animal, but the forest felt different in the dark. Each sound became sharper, more alarming. Another snap echoed, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the direction of the noise. The beam of light cut through the trees but revealed nothing. I tried to calm myself, taking deep breaths, reminding myself that the forest was full of life and that I was an intruder in someone else's world. Yet the sounds continued, soft rustling, occasional snaps, a low groan of something moving through the underbrush. I could feel my senses heighten, every sound amplified. My fire seemed small against the darkness, my flashlight a fragile shield. Around midnight, the noises escalated. I could hear footsteps or something similar to footsteps, moving in a circle around my clearing. There were moments of silence, then a sudden crack, the sound of a branch breaking under weight. I realized my firelight might be drawing attention, and I quickly added more wood, making the fire blaze brighter. I stayed as still as possible, listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath along with me. Hours passed this way. Every time I thought I could rest, the sounds would return. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the firelight, shadows shifting unnaturally fast. I had no idea what I was seeing. Maybe deer, maybe something bigger. I didn't want to find out. I remembered the advice to stay calm, to not make sudden movements, and to keep my presence known through light and noise if needed. I kept a stick in my hand, just in case, and stayed alert. As dawn approached, the noises gradually stopped. The forest became lighter, the shadows shorter, and the air calmer. Exhausted, I finally managed a few hours of restless sleep. When I woke, the clearing looked normal, almost serene. The sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped, and the stream glistened in the morning light. I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering unease. Nothing had touched me, but the previous night had left its mark. I packed up my gear, double-checking the tent and my supplies. I decided not to take any shortcuts and to follow the trail I had come in on. As I walked, I noticed subtle signs that I had missed before. Broken branches at eye level, footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized, patches of disturbed earth where it seemed something had been lurking. I tried to keep my pace steady, not looking back, and focusing on reaching the trailhead. Hours later, I emerged from the dense forest and reached my car. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I loaded my pack into the trunk, started the engine, and sat there for a few minutes, breathing heavily. The forest behind me looked peaceful in the daylight, the events of the night seeming almost unreal. Still, I knew what I had experienced was real. I drove home in silence, exhausted, every muscle aching, my mind replaying the sounds and shadows of the night. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of moving through the forest under silent scrutiny. I returned to the same area months later, but never camped overnight again. I stuck to daytime hikes, familiar trails, and places where help was accessible. I realized that nature was beautiful but also indifferent, and sometimes the things you fear are not supernatural. They are the reality of living in a world where humans are not the apex of every forest. The lesson I carried with me was simple but enduring. Preparation matters, awareness matters, and solitude in the wild comes with responsibility and caution. I had survived the night, and that survival was a victory, but I had also learned to respect the forest in a way I never had before. No fairy tales, no ghosts, no illusions. Just the raw, unpredictable reality of nature, and my ability to endure it. Even now, when I think about that night, the memory is vivid. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the tension of waiting for something I could not see. And yet, I survived, and that survival gave me a strange sense of strength. I knew I could handle solitude, fear, and uncertainty. But I also knew that some places, some nights, demand respect, patience, and caution. And that is how I ended up back in the world of light, leaving the forest with its dark secrets behind, carrying a story that would remind me forever that reality itself can be terrifying, and surviving it is more than just luck. It is careful observation, calm thinking, and respect for the unknown that surrounds us. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. The plan had been simple. Leave the city behind for a weekend, find a quiet spot deep in the forest, and spend 2 days away from phones, people, and everything else. I packed my car with everything I thought I would need: tent, sleeping bag, extra clothing, food, water, first aid supplies, a flashlight, a small axe, and a couple of knives. I had mapped out a trail I wanted to follow, one that ran along a creek and eventually led to a small clearing I had spotted on satellite images. The drive itself was uneventful at first. The city gradually disappeared behind me, replaced by open fields and then dense trees. The road narrowed to a gravel path, with potholes large enough to throw my car off balance if I wasn't careful. By the time I reached the last small parking area before the trailhead, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already beginning to dip, turning the sky orange and red. I parked, checked my backpack, and began walking. The forest was alive with sound: birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant splash of water from the creek. At first, I felt exhilarated, the kind of freedom that only comes when you are completely alone in nature. The trail was rougher than I expected. Fallen branches, rocks, and uneven ground forced me to keep my eyes on my feet, though I tried to take in the surroundings when I could. After an hour of hiking, I began to see signs that the area wasn't often visited. The trail grew over with plants, broken only occasionally by animal tracks. I tried to identify them: deer, maybe a coyote, possibly a rabbit, but nothing seemed to signal danger yet. I stopped every so often to drink water, catch my breath, and take photos. I liked to document these trips, though I knew the photos could never capture the stillness, the subtle smells of earth and pine, the almost tangible quiet that fills a place when people aren't around. By the time I reached the clearing I had targeted, the light had shifted. It was golden, almost surreal, but shadows were already creeping across the ground. I dropped my pack and began setting up my tent. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, ringed by taller trees. There was a small patch of flat dirt, perfect for the tent, though the ground was littered with twigs and small stones. I cleared it carefully, laying down a tarp first, then the tent. As I worked, I noticed that the creek ran just beyond the trees to the east. The sound of running water was comforting, and I made a mental note to go down later to collect water. Once the tent was set up, I unpacked my sleeping bag and a few supplies. I had brought a portable stove, but the idea of cooking over an open fire felt more authentic, so I gathered wood from nearby. Twigs, branches, anything that would catch quickly. The fire began to crackle as the sun disappeared completely. Shadows deepened in the forest, and the temperature dropped quickly. I could feel the chill in my bones, the kind that no amount of walking seems to chase away. I sat by the fire for a while, eating canned beans and bread, trying to ignore the unease that had started to creep in. It wasn't anything specific, just a sense of being watched, a prickling at the back of my neck. I told myself it was the usual paranoia when alone in the woods, but the feeling lingered. Every small sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I checked my knife, then my axe, trying to reassure myself that I was prepared. As darkness settled, the forest transformed. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt oppressive. The rustling of small animals continued, but there were heavier sounds, too. Branches cracking under weight, the kind that seemed too large for a fox or rabbit. I stood up and scanned the tree line with my flashlight, but all I could see were shadows and the occasional glint of something moving too fast to identify. My heartbeat quickened, and I realized that I had never been this isolated before. My car was a mile back down a rough trail, my phone had no signal, and no one knew exactly where I was. I tried to shake it off and focused on preparing the night. I moved my pack and valuables into the tent and used a small lantern to illuminate the perimeter of my camp. I wanted to sleep, but my mind refused to relax. Every noise seemed amplified. The creek's flow, the hiss of my fire, the distant calls of unknown creatures. Hours passed like this, my body exhausted but my mind alert. At some point, I realized that the sounds I had been dismissing might not be animals. There was a heavier, slower step in the underbrush, not random but deliberate. I froze, listening, trying to tell whether it was just the wind moving branches or someone, or something, approaching. The steps stopped, almost as if whoever or whatever it was had noticed me. My stomach knotted, and I knew I had to be ready. I grabbed my axe, the metal cold and heavy in my hands. I told myself it would be enough if I had to defend myself. Minutes passed, and I debated whether I should run to the creek or retreat to my car. Both options were terrifying. My legs refused to move, anchored by fear. The steps started again, this time closer, crunching over fallen leaves and branches. I stayed low, keeping my flashlight dim, praying that whoever it was would move on. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, unmistakable. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. This was bigger, closer. I tried to make myself small, silent, imagining that maybe it would pass. The growl was followed by the sound of heavy breathing, deliberate and slow. It circled my camp, coming closer, then stopping. The hair on my arms and neck stood on end. I realized that no one in their right mind should be this far out at this time of night. Whoever or whatever was there had a purpose. I stayed crouched for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. My fire was almost out, and I had no idea if it was attracting attention or not. My flashlight's battery was low, and I tried not to move. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. Silence. No rustling, no breathing, no sound except the creek, distant now, muffled by the trees. I waited, straining my ears, but nothing came. The first light of dawn was a relief I had never felt before. Shadows lifted, and I could see clearly. My fire had burned to embers. The clearing was intact, nothing disturbed, though I could see heavy prints in the soft earth around my tent. Not human, large, elongated, clawed. I traced them with my eyes and realized they led into the forest and away, disappearing quickly. I didn't hesitate. I packed my things with speed I didn't know I had, checked my gear twice, and started walking back down the trail. Every snap of a branch, every bird taking flight made me jump, but I kept moving. The forest was different in daylight, less threatening, more normal, but I didn't stop until I reached my car, covered in sweat and dirt, with adrenaline still running high. Once inside, I locked the doors, checked my surroundings, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I didn't want to think about what could have been waiting in that clearing if I hadn't woken to the dawn. The drive back was long, but I felt relief with every mile. The city slowly appeared. Lights, noise, people. Felt like stepping into a different world. I made it home safely. My gear went into storage, untouched for weeks. I went back to camping eventually, but never that far into the wilderness, never alone, never without making sure someone knew exactly where I was. And though the story ended with my safe return, I couldn't shake the memory of those heavy prints, the growl that vibrated through the night, or the feeling of being watched by something huge and patient. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had been lucky, and for the first time, I understood the raw, unfiltered power of nature and how fragile a human being can be when alone in it. I had been planning the trip for months. Not a flashy, Instagram-style camping trip, but a real, deep-in-the-woods experience where I would be completely on my own with nature. The thought of leaving cell service behind, stepping into the thick wilderness, and testing my survival skills filled me with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. I packed my gear carefully, checking and rechecking the essentials. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, food for a week, a water filter, fire-starting tools, a first aid kit, a compass, and maps. I had studied the area thoroughly, making notes of trails, rivers, and potential hazards. I felt confident in my preparation. The day I left, the sky was clear, with the sun just beginning to rise. I drove along the winding forest roads, passing occasional hikers and campers who waved at me from their cars. When I finally reached the trailhead, the quiet settled in instantly. I locked the car and hoisted my backpack over my shoulders. Felt heavy, but manageable. My plan was to hike deep into the forest until I reached a spot that was far from any other campers or trails, where I could set up my base for a week. The trail started easy, sloping gently upwards through tall pines and oaks. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting patterns of light on the dirt path. Birds sang, and the wind rustled the trees. Everything felt normal, peaceful, almost idyllic. I passed a small stream and stopped to fill my water bottles, marveling at the clarity of the water and the way it tumbled over smooth rocks. I knew I was heading deeper than most people ventured, and that thought excited me. Hours passed. The trail became less distinct, overgrown in places, with fallen branches and patches of mud. I relied on my compass and map, marking landmarks in my mind to avoid losing my way. The forest grew denser, darker, the sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. The sounds of civilization had disappeared entirely, replaced by the hum of insects and the distant calls of birds. I felt a rush of freedom and solitude, but also a tiny prickling of unease. I reminded myself that I was prepared and careful. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a river bend. It was perfect. Flat ground for my tent, access to water, and thick enough trees around for shelter and privacy. I set up camp, pounding stakes into the soil and stretching my tent tight. I gathered firewood from the surrounding area, careful not to strip the living trees, and built a modest fire pit. I unpacked my food, boiled water, and cooked a simple dinner. Sitting by the fire as the sun dipped lower, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. I was alone, self-sufficient, in a place untouched by other humans. As night fell, the forest changed. Shadows stretched and shifted, and the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, the fire still glowing beside me. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me flinch, though I told myself it was just animals moving around. I reminded myself that I had packed extra blankets, that I knew the area, that I was capable of handling whatever nature threw at me. Still, a subtle tension settled over me, a feeling that I was no longer entirely in control. Around midnight, I woke to an unfamiliar sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A low, crunching step over dead leaves somewhere beyond the clearing. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, moving along the edge of my camp. My first thought was a deer or a bear, but something about the way the steps paused and shifted made me uneasy. I reached slowly for my flashlight, trying not to make any sudden movements. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but nothing moved. Then I saw a flicker, a shadow just beyond the firelight, too human-shaped to be an animal. My stomach dropped. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. I knew my fire could keep animals at bay, but it could do little against a human who wanted to approach silently. I grabbed my small survival knife, gripping it tightly, and sat perfectly still. The shadow moved again, and I realized it was circling my camp, careful to stay in the dark. My heart pounded. I tried to remember my training, the safety measures I had read about, but panic made it hard to think clearly. I stayed motionless for what felt like an hour, though it might have been minutes. Eventually, the movements ceased. I didn't dare leave the tent, but sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night listening to every noise, imagining someone lurking just outside the perimeter, waiting for a mistake. At first light, I stepped out cautiously, knife in hand, scanning the area. There was no one, no footprints in the mud, no broken branches, nothing. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that my fear had created shadows that weren't there, but a faint sense of unease lingered. The next few days passed slowly. I stayed alert at all times, checking the perimeter of the clearing, keeping the fire going longer into the night, and avoiding movement near the edges of the forest. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of a squirrel, the snap of a twig, forcing me to stop and assess whether it was something dangerous or just an animal. I avoided going far from my campsite after dark, rationed my food carefully, and kept water boiled at all times. Despite the tension, I began to settle into a rhythm, telling myself that I was cautious and prepared. On the fourth night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the tent. I had reinforced the stakes, but the tent walls flapped against my body, making it hard to sleep. Somewhere in the distance, branches cracked, and the sound of running water from the river below intensified. At one point, I thought I heard movement near the fire pit. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out slowly, scanning the darkness. Again, nothing. My mind was fraying with anxiety and exhaustion. I realized I could not stay completely alert forever. Sleep was necessary, but it came with risk. The fifth day brought a new challenge: rain. A steady, drenching rain that soaked the ground, making trails slippery and the forest even darker. I had anticipated rain and prepared waterproof gear, but the constant wetness tested my stamina. My fire became difficult to maintain, and I had to spend hours collecting dry kindling from sheltered spots. I slipped once on the muddy bank while fetching water, hitting my shoulder against a rock. The pain throbbed for hours, and I realized how fragile I truly was in this environment. One wrong step, one misjudgment could end the trip or worse. That night, rain hammered the tent relentlessly. The river swelled, making the low-lying areas of the clearing soggy. I had moved my tent to a slightly higher spot, but the ground was still damp. Sleep was uneasy, punctuated by dreams of being watched. The fear from the first night returned, stronger this time. Every noise seemed closer, more threatening. I tried to remind myself that humans rarely ventured into such remote areas at night, but the memory of that shadow persisted in my mind. On the sixth day, the weather cleared, and I decided to explore further upriver. I packed light, leaving most of my supplies at the camp, and moved cautiously along the rocky riverbank. The forest here was thicker, the terrain uneven. I slipped several times on wet stones, each fall scraping my hands and legs. I was constantly aware of the need to remain balanced and focused. About halfway through my exploration, I noticed a small, makeshift trap, ropes tied between trees, a crude snare near a rabbit hole. My heart leapt. Someone had been here recently and not for casual hiking. I took pictures for my records but stayed extremely alert. The idea that another human was nearby, potentially dangerous, made my skin crawl. By late afternoon, I returned to camp exhausted but more vigilant than ever. I reinforced the perimeter, checked the fire pit, and prepared extra tools for defense. That night, I did not sleep at all. I stayed awake, sitting near the fire, listening to every sound. The forest seemed alive with movement. Branches snapped at odd intervals, leaves rustled without wind, and water trickled in ways that made my imagination run wild. I refused to let fear paralyze me, but every muscle in my body was tense. I had to remain calm, measured, and ready. On the 7th day, I decided it was time to leave. I packed everything carefully, ensuring I left no trace, but I moved with heightened caution. I noticed more signs of human presence. Footprints in the mud that were not mine, discarded wrappers, small piles of debris. I realized that I had been sharing the forest with someone else the entire week. Someone who might have been watching my camp, moving quietly around the edges, waiting. Panic rose, but I reminded myself that I had the advantage. Knowledge of the terrain, a packed vehicle, and preparation. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept scanning the forest, listening for any sign of pursuit. Every shadow seemed to flicker with intent, but I focused on moving quickly and efficiently. The trail, once a source of comfort, now felt treacherous. Roots and rocks threatened my footing, and the exhaustion from a week in the wilderness weighed heavily on me. But slowly, steadily, I made progress, keeping my knife close and my senses sharp. By late afternoon, the edge of the forest appeared. I broke into a run, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. The distant hum of cars and people reassured me. The road came into view, my car waiting just beyond the tree line. I checked over my shoulder once, then twice, seeing nothing. Relief flooded through me as I approached the vehicle. I locked the doors behind me, sat inside, and let myself breathe for the first time in days. Driving away, I replayed every moment of the trip in my mind. The beauty of the forest, the thrill of isolation, the fear of the unknown, and the reminder of my own vulnerability. I realized that no matter how well prepared, no matter how careful, the wilderness demanded respect, and humans could be just as dangerous as nature itself. The trip ended safely, but the lessons lingered. Vigilance was essential, solitude was intoxicating but risky, and the world beyond civilization could be unforgiving. I would return to civilization with a renewed appreciation for life, for safety, and for the subtle balance between courage and caution. The forest had tested me, challenged me, and left me changed, more aware of the fragility of human life when stripped of comfort and familiarity. I had planned the trip for months. I told myself I needed a break from everything. The city, the noise, the constant rush of people and traffic and obligations. I wanted nothing but the woods, a quiet place to hike, set up camp, and just be alone with myself. It wasn't supposed to be complicated. Just me, my pack, a tent, and the wilderness. I had chosen a remote national forest in the northern part of the state, somewhere that had trails but also areas where few people went. I thought that would be perfect, peaceful, isolating, and safe enough. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning, my car crunching over gravel and dirt as I parked. I took a moment to look around. The air was crisp, the kind that made your lungs feel like they were expanding, and the forest ahead was dense. Pines towered over everything, their trunks straight and gray, with dark green needles that blocked the sunlight from reaching the forest floor. There were patches of moss and ferns, mushrooms growing in small clusters, and a smell of damp earth and pine sap. I carried my backpack, heavier than I had realized, filled with food, water, a small stove, some extra clothes, a first aid kit, and other essentials. The first few miles of the trail were easy. It was clear and marked, with occasional fallen logs that forced me to step over or around. Birds called to each other from the treetops, and somewhere in the distance, a stream bubbled along. I felt good. My legs were sore, but it was the kind of sore that came from movement, from using muscles I didn't use much in the city. I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water and check my map. By late afternoon, I had reached the area I planned to set up camp. It was a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines that offered some wind protection. The ground was uneven but clear enough to pitch my tent. I chose a spot that was slightly elevated, just in case it rained. The wind rustled the needles, and a few stray clouds moved across the sun, casting shadows that danced on the forest floor. I started setting up my tent, the fabric stiff and the poles resisting my movements, but eventually, it stood upright. I felt a small sense of accomplishment. After that, I gathered wood for a fire. Not a big one, just enough for cooking and warmth. The dry wood snapped under my hands, and the smell of burning pine filled the air as I coaxed a flame into life. I cooked a simple meal, some canned beans and rice, and ate slowly, listening to the forest around me. Everything seemed fine. I even started feeling relaxed in a way I hadn't felt in months. But as the sun dipped lower, the forest changed. The shadows grew longer and darker, and the sounds shifted. Birds stopped calling, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant crack of branches underfoot. I told myself it was normal, the forest was alive. Small animals moved through the undergrowth, and I was simply hearing them. Yet there was a tension in the air I couldn't shake. It was subtle at first, but then it started pressing on me, like an unspoken warning. I decided to walk a short distance from camp to collect more firewood. The light was fading fast, and I knew I needed a fire for the night. I walked carefully, stepping over roots and rocks, listening to every sound. That's when I heard it. A crack, like someone stepping on a branch, but too deliberate, too heavy to be a squirrel. My stomach dropped. I froze, straining my ears. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just a tree branch falling or some animal moving through the underbrush, but the hair on my arms stood on end. I started walking back toward the campsite, quickening my pace. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer, and it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like footsteps. I stopped, holding my breath. The sound stopped too, but I could feel it. Eyes on me even though I couldn't see anything. Panic rose, and I broke into a run, my legs moving as fast as they could over the uneven ground. I didn't look back. The forest around me became a blur of trunks and shadows. I made it to my tent, heart pounding, and slammed the zipper shut behind me. I grabbed a small hatchet I kept with my gear, just in case, and sat on my sleeping bag, listening. My fire had gone out in the last half hour, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim light of my headlamp. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, made me jump. I tried to calm myself, breathing in and out, telling myself it was probably just an animal, or maybe the wind. But I knew the sound of footsteps I had heard wasn't natural. I stayed awake most of the night, listening, watching the shadows around my tent. At one point, I thought I heard breathing outside, shallow and deliberate, and I gripped the hatchet so tightly my hands ached. Hours passed slowly, each minute stretching out. I didn't dare step outside to check the fire. The moon rose, partially obscured by clouds, giving me just enough light to see the outline of trees around the clearing. When the first faint light of dawn appeared, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything quickly, leaving nothing behind, and started moving down the trail toward the nearest ranger station. I didn't stop. Every rustle, every shadow, every bird call made me flinch. The forest that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt like a maze designed to trap me. I walked for hours, my legs screaming, my pack heavy, my heart still racing. Finally, late in the morning, I reached a small road. A car passed, and I waved my arms, shouting until it slowed. The driver stopped and looked at me in surprise, and I ran to the vehicle. I explained, in broken sentences, that I had been camping and felt like someone had been following me. The driver offered to take me to the ranger station, which was only a few miles away. At the station, rangers took my statement seriously. They didn't laugh or dismiss me. They had heard similar reports in that area. A few campers had reported feeling watched, finding their camps disturbed, or noticing footprints around their tents. Nothing violent had happened yet, but they warned me to be cautious. I returned home that day, shaken but unharmed. It took weeks before I could stop feeling that shadow of fear in the back of my mind, the memory of the footsteps, the feeling of being watched in the silent forest. I never went back to that campsite, and I avoided camping alone for years. But over time, I understood something important. Fear is not always about monsters or ghosts. Sometimes, it's about the reality of being vulnerable, of being alone in a place where danger could be hiding just beyond your sight. It's about paying attention to your instincts, respecting the unknown, and understanding that the wilderness doesn't bend to your plans. The forest isn't evil, and the people or animals who might be there aren't always predictable. That night taught me the value of preparation, of vigilance, and the quiet respect you must have when you step into a world that is not yours. I still camp, but differently. I stay on marked trails, I check in with rangers, I carry more tools, more lights, more ways to protect myself. And I never ignore the small signs, the broken branch, the footstep in the dirt, the rustle that seems too deliberate. I learned that night that fear can save you, as long as you don't let it paralyze you. That was the lesson I carried home from the forest, a lesson written in adrenaline and unease, but ultimately, a lesson that saved me.